Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we're going to focus on how to write the contents of our object to a CSV file. In an earlier video, you saw how to collect information from the command line, store it in an object, and then ultimately take the contents of that object and write it to a custom text file. And that's fine. That's a perfectly good way of going by doing things. But what if you wanted to store all of the information for all of your users in a single file? We would need a different file format other than our custom format to do so. Our custom format relies on a single file per user, whereas a CSV file could allow for us to store the information about multiple users all in one file. Now, this video is not going to focus on how to search the contents of that file. We're going to save that for a later video. Instead, what we're going to do is we're fundamentally going to log the information about the user and just simply store it into a CSV file. So to begin with, what I want to do is I want to take a quick look at our ExportInfoToCustom. And we're going to be keeping roughly the same behavior here. In other words, instead of checking necessarily to see if the file exists by virtue of the Blazor ID, or in other words, blazorID.txt, we're going to be using a users.csv, but fundamentally the same process is going to happen. We're going to use an output file as well as an output file writer. The difference being is instead of writing the contents of the file line by line, we're going to put it all in one line separated by commas. And the second thing is, instead of overwriting the file, we are going to append it. So we get to see another overload of our file writer constructor. But other than that, the process is going to be very similar. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing that we want to do is to go ahead and create our function signature. And again, we're going to keep it very similar to the earlier one. As a matter of fact, if you want to, you can go ahead and copy it, save yourself a little bit of time. But we're going to do a public static void again with all of the discussion that came in the earlier video about what our return values could potentially be. For right now, we're going to keep it simple. And we're simply going to have export info to CSV, and we are again going to accept an object of type EE333.CollectedInfo, and we are going to call that sample collected info. So again, just to recap, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to log all of the user information in a single file and append the information regardless of whether it already exists. Again, not so much a problem, just simply a slight limitation to keep this video a little simpler and to focus solely on the file I/O. And so the first thing that we want to do is to go ahead and create our two objects that we're going to need. The first one is going to be of type Java IO.file. And again, we're simply going to call it an output file. We're not going to initialize it. In other words, we're not going to call the constructor. And then the second one is going to be java.io.FileWriter. And again, we're going to call it output file writer. Now, as far as checking what we want to do here, we are not going to need to check necessarily all of the fields, but you would want to come up with a way to validate each one of the fields. Definitely or arguably at least the Blazor ID. Now, we're going to cover this in later videos, so I'm not too terribly worried about doing this here. For right now, we're going to assume that we do have all of the information we need from the user. But the other thing that we want to take just a second to talk about is what happens when there is a comma in a field. And to understand what I'm asking, if you take a look back at our sample input file, you noticed that our user was allowed to put commas in between the languages that they had previously worked with. Now, you could argue, train the user, put a prompt, etc., but assume that somehow a comma slipped in past your validation or your error checking. And so at this point, what we want to do is we want to replace all of the commas in all of the fields, or we simply encapsulate all of the fields in double quotes. Now, later on, we're going to be working with how to import the values from a CSV file, so we're going to keep it simple. Right now, what I'm going to encourage you to do is to strip all of the extra commas from all of the fields. So what happens when there is a comma in the field? We simply want to strip/remove it. And remove/replace. We'll decide how we want to go about treating that in just a second. But other than that, then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and initialize or call the constructor for our output file, and we'll say that's going to be equal to new java.io.file. And in this case, we're just going to call this one users.csv. And technically, we would want to go ahead and check to see whether this file already exists. We can do a number of things, but again, we're going to keep this simple. So I'm just going to make a little note here, say possibly check to see if it exists, and then write logic appropriately. Whoops, appropriate logic. But what we want to do now is focus on the appending process. And as we saw from our earlier video, the first thing that we need to do is to go ahead and set up a try-catch block to handle any sort of exceptions or errors that might be as a result of trying to open a file that we don't have permissions to, for instance, or maybe there's a network error. There's a couple of reasons why this would happen. And so the first thing that we want to do is start off with this try-catch block. And inside this try-catch block is where we are going to then initialize or call the constructor for our output file writer. And you'll notice in this particular case, we could have probably avoided using the java.io.file altogether and simply called this third overload. I'm going to discourage us from doing this right now because if anything, it would be good for us to get familiar with this two-step process. And also there's more flexibility in this later on if we use our java.io.file. But we will, however, need to call the overload that allows for us to pass both a file object as well as whether or not to append it. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to call then our fifth overload where we pass the output file as well as true. And again, if there is an exception, then we're going to do two things. Simply call our system.out.println and an error failed to open. And in this case, since we can specify what that is, we'll say users.csv. And then for the second print line, we're just going to simply use the toString method on the exception itself. Now, a good practice in general is every time you open a file for writing, reading, appending, that you remember to close the file so that you're not relying on the framework or your operating system to do so. And now in between here is where we are going to append the contents of the file based on a CSV format. Well, if you followed along in the earlier video, you know that what we did is we modified one of our functions, our toString function, to create a toCustom function. And we're going to do the exact same thing now with our CollectedInfo class. We're going to create another function, except this time it's going to go ahead and provide a CSV output format, as well as removing the commas from the individual fields. And so what we can do here is we can create another function called public with the return java.lang.string as a return type. And then we're going to call this one toCSV. Again, what we want to do is leverage a local return variable. And so we want to return a CSV format stripped of extra commas. And so we're going to have a temporary or local variable of java.lang.string. Might as well go ahead and call it results. We're going to initialize it to a set of double quotes or an empty string. And then before we forget, we're going to just simply go ahead and return our results. Now, at this point, it should probably be pretty clear to you what we're going to do. We're just going to go through field by field without the field name. And in this case, we're going to say results plus equal this dot Blazor ID. And what we're going to do now is we're going to use our replace function to replace a comma with some other value. And again, this could be up for debate. I would argue that we're just simply going to replace it with a space. You could argue that you could replace it with some other character. Doesn't really matter. But basically, the idea here is we're going to replace or remove the comma with another character. And again, this is just a limitation of any delimited file, in that you cannot have the delimiter in the data itself without some other special character, or simply just remove the delimiter from the data. At this point, then we just go through each one of our fields. So there's our first name. Sometimes you'll find that your autocomplete takes longer than simply typing it out. This is definitely the case here. As a matter of fact, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cheat ever so slightly, in that I'm going to leverage a little bit of copying and pasting here. So last name, let's go ahead and put our semicolon here, speed things up a little bit. So it's first name, last name, initials, languages, goals, graduation, computer model, computer CPU, computer memory. And at this point, then it just simply becomes an exercise in patience. This would probably be a great time for you to go ahead and pause me, see if you can complete it, and come back and check. I'm just speeding this up by hitting the Control space bar. Computer model. Computer CPU. And computer memory. I feel like I've missed one here. Let's go back and check one more time. Blazor ID, first name, last name, initials, languages, goals for the class, goals, professional, graduation. Nope, apparently I just have an extra one in here. No big deal. The important thing to note, though, is at the end of this results here, you've got a couple of decisions to make. In other words, do you put the new line on the end, or do you allow the calling function to do so? You could make the argument both ways. I'm actually going to include it here, but leave it as a comment. So what we're going to do is we're going to have results are going to be equal to or plus equals, and then our new line. And I'm just going to put a little comment here. Note, this may be handled in the calling function. Okay, so again, you have some choices there, whether or not you include the new line here or you handle it in the calling function. And basically, you just don't want to handle it in both places or in neither place. Okay, at this point, though, what we can do is we can go back to our calling function. In other words, our ExportInfoToCSV. And at this point, this should be very straightforward, very similar, as a matter of fact, to what we saw earlier. It's going to be our output file writer, and it's going to be append. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass to it the sample collected info, and you should now see our toCSV here. And if you had chosen not to handle the new line in the toCSV function, then what you would do is you would just simply append it here. Again, either approach is perfectly fine. You just don't want to forget to do it entirely. So again, I'm just going to pick one or the other rather than to do it both. You'll quickly know whether you have forgotten to do it or not. And at this point, we should be able to build our application. And sure enough, it builds successful. And it's time now to update our main. We're just going to go ahead and borrow our entire function from an earlier video where we exported info to custom, because essentially we're doing the exact same thing here, with the difference being we are appending our output file. So we're going to change it from export info to custom to export info to CSV. And at this point, then, instead of exporting info to custom, we're again just going to change our function call and should be able to build it. We can go back to our command window and simply run it using our export info to CSV. Again, we're going to leverage our input.txt file. Need to go back and check the contents of that briefly. There we go. And go ahead and run it. You still have the call to our display info because we chose not to remove it from the get info. But more importantly, if I type in dir, in addition to the previous text files from the earlier function call to the export info to custom, we now also have an additional file called users.csv. You want to be careful about double clicking it and opening it in Excel. We'll see what happens with that in just a second, but you can see now that I don't quite have it right. And so you probably may have already picked up on what I did wrong. If anything, remember that when you are exporting, and particularly when you are choosing the file format, you have complete control over the output. We managed to replace, for instance, the commas in the languages field, but we forgot to include the commas between the fields. And so you may have already picked up on that when we were working through this, and if so, you may have already corrected this, but it's pretty easy for us to change. In other words, we simply just go through and on each one of our fields, we add the comma. And so we're just going to append each one of our lines here. Again, if you caught this earlier, that's fantastic. You know what we're trying to do. And then this last one, then, if you think about it, we would not have to append the comma Instead, it's the responsibility of the new line and wherever we decide to put it. At this point, let's go ahead and build our project one more time. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to just go ahead and delete our users.csv since we know that it's wrong. Let's rerun this one more time. Let's open our users.csv again. And it definitely looks a lot better than it did last time. And you can see where I have stripped out the commas from the individual fields, particularly our languages field. And you have then all of the information. Now, to see how this behaves differently from our earlier function, we're just simply going to rerun it again. And because I'm appending the file, every time I rerun it, I'm simply going to get another log of that user, as well as if I come into our input file, just going to put gmyers2 there again, run it again, and I'll see a fourth line, and so on. I'm going to change this back once again, and then I'm going to do one last thing. I am going to, instead of opening this in NetBeans, I'm going to open this in a different application. I'm going to open it in Excel. And again, you can see how it's very nicely handled in Excel. Excel is a great tool for handling CSV files, but I'm going to leave this open, okay? And then I'm going to come back over to our application, and I'm going to run it one more time. And you'll see that we have now triggered an exception. And what happened was the Excel application has locked our file for editing. Whether we read or write from it is another question, but it has locked it for editing. And our application, our Java application, will throw an exception because it cannot get exclusive access to append the .csv file. Again, different applications behave differently. If you notice, NetBeans actually watches the file system to see if the file is updated. If you, for instance, were to open your users.csv in Notepad, you would not get that behavior. Different editors handle it differently. And in the case of Microsoft Excel, it actually locks the file so that you cannot get access to it. So there are various reasons why you would have to catch an exception in the case of opening a file. And of course, we can simply just close out Excel, don't save, and then rerun it, and everything's fine again. As a matter of fact, you can drag and drop this into NetBeans to verify that sure enough, there is an additional run of our application. So as always, hopefully you found this video useful. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.